Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to SORMAG's Book Festival. I'm LaShonda Hoffman, and we are back for day 2. I'm super excited to be here, and we have a great panel ready for you to talk about writing. So today is all about asking the panel what about writing. So bring your questions. I've got some questions, and I hope this is going to be a great conversation. So are you ready to meet our panel? Come on in. Y'all up early. Hello, hello, hello. So today we've got Miss Janet Ruth Haler. We got E.B. Noble, our new debut author. We got Katie Richards. Oh, I'm so excited to see you guys here. I'm just gonna ask the first basic question is who are you and how did you get into writing? Tell me a little bit about yourself and what you write.
Where do you want to start?
I'll start with Janet. Go ahead, and then we'll go around to Katie.
I don't want to monopolize anything. I started writing when I was in first grade, and I wrote a poem about flying a kite with my dad. He worked very hard, and I didn't get to see him very often. So it was wonderful when I did get to spend time with him. And the teacher liked the poem so much that she did it off for the class. So I guess that was my first publication. I write poetry. I write children's books. I write dramas. I write essays. I'm working on an autobiography / memoir. I've published all sorts of books, and I can answer questions about poetry, nonfiction, stories, anything that you write, I can answer. I used to teach creative writing at the college level. I have a doctorate in English, and I've also taught women's studies.
I'm Katie Richards. I write romantic suspense, and thrillers primarily. And like Janet, I started writing early. My mother, the high school English teacher, or was a high school English teacher for 35 years. So we've read a lot growing up. And my dad just loved books. So he was also kind of on the reading bandwagon. So that's where my love of reading started. And then one day I thought, I can do this. Let me try to write a story. And I was about maybe 10 years old at that point, and wrote a short story about a little girl who gets lost in the woods and defeats a monster. So and it just went from there. A love of mysteries sprouted from that.
Oh, looks like we lost LaShonda. Good afternoon. I was going to say morning, but good afternoon, everybody. I am, for right now, author Aziza Sphinx. I actually also write under the pen name Energy Write. So I'm a techie by trade, but a writer by necessity. I have been writing for a very long time, just like our other panelists. My mother, too, was a high school English teacher. So we definitely grew up with books. I started out growing up really more with comics. My sister was more into comics, even though we were exposed to books. So I know some of the comic stuff. for myself, I do write across the board. So I've done urban fiction, science fiction, fantasy, sci-fantasy, some poetry. I actually started out as a song lyricist. So I have a degree in music industry, and I worked in that industry way longer than I probably should have. But I kind of know the writing perspective from both the music and from, traditional novel types. I have tried my hand at short stories, but it just kind of doesn't. My characters get long-winded, and so it starts out as a short story, and then it turns into 180,000 words in 30 days. Do not recommend. So that's kind of where I am as a writer. So any questions like related to all kind of different genres, I'm your person to go to.
Go ahead,
Hello,
EA.
hello. I am EA Noble and I write queer fantasy for the culture. And I started writing when I was, oh my goodness. So when I was a baby, I had a different journey. I didn't fall in love with books first. I fell in love with journaling first. And my grandmother bought me some of my first journals, and she said, sit down, write your thoughts out, and tell your story, even if it's to yourself. And that's how I started writing. I'm an avid journaler. And then I grew up and I fell in love with books and stories and how to engage in stories. And I am of the Wattpad era. So I used to be heavily on Wattpad growing up. And at one point, I had so many followers and I was so big on Wattpad that people were stealing my works and trying to make money off books that I wrote on Wattpad. And I was thinking to myself, if my writing is that good that people are starting to try to steal it and make a profit, I might as well try myself. And so I began to start writing my own books. I started off in poetry because I love the spoken word. I love the performance of the spoken word. And then I went to paranormal, supernatural, urban fiction, fantasy, science fiction. And at this point, I write anything and all things speculative fiction. That that is my realm of writing. So yeah, nice to meet everyone.
I love it. I love it. As you can see, our esteemed host, when you're trying to do something great, stuff will always happen. And that's why we have to do what? Be ye also ready. So here am I am Shawana Kennedy. And yes, as you can see over my shoulder, I am an author. I'm actually a self-help author. And while we wait for LaShonda to get back in here, because she runs this ship better than anyone we know, I actually have a question for you. Can you share insight on your writing process? And we'll start in order of Miss Janet.
Thank you. I often get an idea when I'm taking a walk or when I'm with other people, and sometimes someone will tell a very interesting story, or I'm with family members and one of my relatives says something interesting, or I'm telling a story about something that happened a long time ago, and I'll think, that would make a good poem, or that would make a good essay, or, I'd like to write about that. So then I go home, and before I learned how to write computers, I used to write on yellow pads of paper. I like colors, so I would write on yellow pads of paper before I learned how to use a computer. But these days I do a lot on computers. Though everywhere I go, I do take paper and pen just in case an idea comes. Once one of my doctors was running really late, and he was about an hour and a half late. And instead of blowing my top, I wound up writing a very long poem while I was waiting for the doctor. So I would strongly recommend always taking something to write on, even if you just write a note about something you want to write something about. And then I always come back and revise it and revise it and revise it. And I have a writer's group. So when I think I've gotten a draft that is decent, I'll show it to my writer's group. And our writer's group usually has suggestions for revision. Or sometimes I'll say the draft is okay as it is, but usually there are some suggestions for revision. So then I spend more time revising and then I send it out. So I try to be patient with that process because sometimes it can take a while.
I love that. Miss Katie, what about your writing process?
Process. It's different all the time. The one constant is I am an outliner. So I try to outline or I do outline all the stories, although I don't necessarily stick to them. So I start out with an idea, and as Janet mentioned, it could come from anywhere. Sometimes I'll see something that's interesting on a walk or when I'm out, or I will read something that sparks an idea, and then it kind of grows from there. And at that point, at the beginning, it's usually I usually write by hand when I'm trying to refine ideas. I find it's easier for me, so I have a bunch of notebooks and they're all filled with scratches and half ideas and dropped ideas and a couple of things that actually went somewhere. And then once I've refined it and figured out the characters and the motivations and the whys, and for me it's important to know what the end looks like, because I need to know where I'm going. So often I don't know how I'm getting there, but I do know where I'm going. And then I'll sit down and start writing it. And hopefully it turns into something. That doesn't always happen. Sometimes you start writing and then it's just not good, or it's not the time for that piece at the moment. And you move on to the next thing.
Yeah, I love that. I love that when I think about how the brain works for me, because I'm actually visual. So I picture it, and then even to write, for me to write is to remember. And I love, like Miss Janet was talking about, taking notes. So for me to even write it, even though of course we have all these smart devices that can capture information for us, to write it is for me to remember it even more. And of course, it does help with the creative process.
Right.
So those are some things that I even think about. I love that. Well, welcome. I'd like to know, what about you, Miss Aziza?
Okay, so for me, I am an empathic writer. So I do as I'm told. I have no say-so over what my stories are, where they come from, how they go about. I fought that for a very long time to the detriment of my mental health. So I really had to just let go and acknowledge that I am here to be the scribe, and I just, tell the stories however the characters want me to tell them. They typically give me the end of a story, and sometimes it'll be give me the end, give me the beginning, and then we have to kind of figure out how the two go together. Sometimes it's just they give me the end, and then, once I have that actually written, how it's going to end, I can go back and start wherever. I am not a linear writer, so I'm very much a pantser, and whatever chapter comes to me at that time is the chapter that I'm going to write, even if it's just bits and pieces. One of the tips that I kind of use if I'm in the process of actually getting these stories down is, if they give me something and I get kind of to the middle, but it goes quiet in my head, but I may end up then with some stuff for maybe a chapter later, or there's like a chunk of information that is missing that I know I'll need to fill in later. I'll take a highlight. I'll just highlight that. So whether I'm doing it by hand or using the computer, I'll put in like parentheses, more information here, and highlight it. That way, when I get ready to go back through and they give me that rest of that information, or I'm in the editing process, I can go back and easily identify places where there may be plot holes, places where there may be inconsistencies, information that I just easily to be able to visually see. You know, you don't have to go through and look for parentheses or something like that. Or as you're reading, you can just open your document, look for highlights, and then try to complete whatever it was that was missing at that time. I'm also a cyclical writer, so my characters tend to start talking to me in the June, July, up through the end of the year. So I do most of my writing during that time. I have done Nano for most years, and that's typically when I get my one book done. So Nano is National Novel Writing Month, the month of December, and I will get at the very least, you know, a big chunk of any work that I'm working on done. Though my first book I wrote in August, and like I said, it was 180,000 words in 30 days. I do not recommend anybody do that unless you know that's kind of your full-time job. But again, for my mental health and actually to be able to function in the world, I had to do what I was told, and that's kind of what my process is.
Woo! You really said a whole. Everybody is really looking like, okay. I love that. What about you, Miss E.A. Noble?
Okay, for my writing process, I would like to start with a quote that I always have in the back of my mind that I was taught when I was at Jackson State University. Woohoo, HBCU. Not ninth grade, freshman year. And my teacher taught me this quote: I doubt, therefore I think before I am. Therefore I am. And that quote has always stuck with me because when I begin my writing process, it always starts with a doubt or inkling of some sort of question, some sort of what if for the most part. For example, when I wrote my debut book, When Blood Meets Earth, the question was, what if racism didn't exist? And I started pondering, what if that wasn't even a word? What if we lived in a society where we didn't care about our skin or anything? Like, what if? And that started to compile and turn into, this system of organization, politics, how things are ran from the start, from the ground up, all the way to the head, the people, how we shape our vision of community, and it just developed into a full-blown book. And then my second book that's coming out next year, called Supersized Bubblegum, the what if question was, you know what? What if fat people it's because they're fat they gain superpowers? What if? And so, Supersized Bubblegum existed, where 4 fat baddies get powers by eating bubblegum. And that's how that popped off. No pun intended. But yeah, my process always starts with the question. And that question seems to develop. And as I began to write those questions out, I have a list that I ask myself: who, what, when, and where. I ask myself, I just go through and start inputting answers in this little I can't. It's like a reference guide, I should say. I think that's the closest thing I say. I have created my own personal reference guide, where it's just a list of questions that help me flesh out the who, what, when, where, and why. And then once I get all my questions and stuff organized, I then go into a rough outline. And then as I rough outline, I start with the intro, the opening scene, the first act setup, the second act, the third act. And I go in and go in and just make a rough outline and then a rough draft. And then after I do the rough draft, I like my process to I would say a drawer. If you like to draw, when people draw, you have people that, start off with squares and circles and stuff like that. And then as they got their squares and circles set up, they start adding the lines and the curvature. Then they start adding the shadows. Then they start adding, the depth, the skin tone, the hair, the eye color, the skin tones, until it comes together to a full image. And that's oftentimes how I do my writing process. I start with the naked outline, the squares and the squares and the circles, then go back over another revision, add